Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to NPTEL's course on communication skills. We are now on module number 3, lecture number 2 on non-verbal communication. In the first two quizzes in the form of a lecture, I conducted a preview of your knowledge about non-verbal communication, your understanding about body language, so that I start from a stage where I understand that okay, you are at a receptive level now to know something and to develop something about non-verbal communication. Now, if you remember at the beginning of our course, on this course on communication skills, I started with the definition of communication. I explained in detail the process of communication. I talked about the barriers to communication and all that. But in all these lectures, I was not trying to keep verbal communication vis-a-vis non-verbal communication, although I just made a difference. Now, in this lecture, we have this interesting and at the same time the most significant component of communication as such, that is non-verbal communication. Now, in this lecture we will try to understand the definition, we will try to know the significance, because I do not want to let the cat out at this stage. So, you will know that in due course of time. Sufficient to tell you that at the end of the lecture, not only you will be able to enhance your professional image in terms of non-verbal communication, but also you will be able to identify, analyze certain images, certain situations in terms of non-verbal communication. I am just going to show the picture that I have put on the title slide. I am just going to show the same picture at the end of it, and then I will just ensure that you will be able to build up the whole narrative as what is happening in the whole scenario that is depicted in the picture. At this stage, it will appear to you as a simple picture, it may not mean much, but then once you are through some of the tips and techniques of non-verbal communication, you will be able to understand certain things like what is happening in this, who is interested in what, who is more interested in doing what, and so on. Now, why this is important in a professional situation? Because communication, you understand, is a kind of business negotiation. It is an interaction between two people, and you always want to get a favorable response. In order to get that response, you need to know who wants what, and you need to know how you should give them what they want and get what you need. Fine. Now, with this brief introduction, let me tell you the overall plan of this module. In this module, basically you will have a thorough understanding of non-verbal communication, and then I am trying to synonymously equate this mostly with body language, because that seems to be the most important component of non-verbal communication. So, you will also know the importance of body language, followed by the functions of non-verbal communication, the voluntary and involuntary dimensions of non-verbal communication, and then the types of non-verbal communication in relation to body language, and then how these types are used in situations, followed by this applications of non-verbal communication to gain a professional image. So, in this, at the end you will understand the do's and don'ts of non-verbal communication, and especially if you want to build up a professional image, what are those aspects of non-verbal communication that you should avoid, and what is it that you should try to accent, enhance. So, that awareness itself, as I put a question in the preview quiz, is going to help you a lot in eliminating some of the negative behavior in you and cultivating what is most desired and most positive and favorable, especially in professional situations like interview and group discussions and presentations. Now, before we actually go to the types of nonverbal communication, we need to know how we distinguish this from communication as such. Generally, when we think of communication, we think of it in terms of exchanging a message or an idea in the form of words, that is verbal communication, and generally we think that communication is basically verbal. Now, when we talk about non-verbal communication, understand that it is communication without words. Communication without words. What do you do when you communicate without using words will actually amount to non-verbal communication. Now, to put it in another form, this is that aspect of communication using images. It can be in the form of pictures, graphs, symbols, again can be in the form of icons, or just sometimes using some kind of formula, still you will be able to communicate. Signs, gestures, facial expressions, postures, etc. So, you understand that without words, we also use lot of other things like images, signs. Signs, for instance, we are on a traffic jam, and then the jam is controlled actually by the traffic signals. So, we stop when we see red. So, we get ready when we see orange or yellow, and then we are leaving when we see green. So, color is actually acting as a kind of sign and symbolizing certain things related to that sign. So, it tells that you should stop, you should be ready, you should go. Now, no words, and if one has to convey the same thing through words to so many people who are there, so it needs lot more channels, lot more communication, and much more of miscommunication in such a situation. Now, this again brings us to the question that we asked at the beginning in one of the preview quizzes, which is more important. When I am saying that nonverbal can convey more effectively, look at this one. You can use a smile, you can use a frown, and can communicate and convey message without words. Again, look at the situation. Somebody in a place like Mumbai is requesting a friend to meet him at his residence at a particular time. Now, let us say the friend is coming to Mumbai for the first time. Now, he has options, let us say, of either coming by a car or a bus or by a train. These are the options. Now, in case he reaches the bus station, he needs to know where to get down, whether it will be Mumbai Central or Dadar or even before that, or in case let us say he is coming by the train, again he needs to know which station should he get down, and then which train he should take. Suppose the place is let us say in Andheri, should he take the western? Okay. Let us assume that he has asked somebody and found that he has taken the western one. Now, assuming that the friend has just given the address and not said anything, it is very difficult for the friend to realize which side of the platform even to get down. Sometimes strangely enough, people say that, oh, east, you have to get this side, and then it looks like you are actually getting down on the western side. But they say, no, no, this is east, this is west. It looks like that, but what they say is right practically. So, you need to ask again, you need to get more description, more words, more elaboration. And then even when you have got that, get an auto rickshaw driver to take you. If the person does not know the place, you may be just standing exactly on the lane, but you are not able to locate the exact house. Then again you may use a mobile or a phone and then call the friend, ask him to come down or identify the auto rickshaw driver or tell the auto rickshaw driver to speak to the friend to reach the place. Now, imagine another situation where there is a bee, honey bee, and this bee has travelled across some mountains, crossed some rivers, and then reached the dense forest, crossed many trees, and then on the top of a huge tall tree, it found honey on a particular kind of flower and so much of honey. Now, what it does, it comes back and then, unlike a human being who uses lots of words to give even a small address, the honeybee comes back and then in order to indicate the place where honey is situated, it just makes a kind of dance in the form of a clockwise and anti-clockwise direction, which resembles a kind of 8. Okay, it makes a dance in the form of a clockwise, anti-clockwise, and then it resembles the shape of 8. Now, looking at this dance, the rest of the bees make a beeline, they just rush to the spot. On the way, they cross the same number of rivers, on the way they cross the same number of mountains, they cross the same number of trees, and without losing even a single second while crossing them, they exactly know the direction. Now, I am just making an analogy, if you understand, between human communication used in terms of words to give an address and close friends. In a metropolitan city, words are used, 90% chances are there that if the friend is meeting the other one for the first time, he is likely to get lost and it is very difficult for him to trace out that house. Compare this with the honey bees, one bee locating the honey, coming back and then conveying the message in the non-verbal form without words in the form of dance. And then it is able to take them to the exact location without wasting time, without wasting energy. Now, the question is, which form of communication is much more effective, which form is superior? Obviously, it is very easy to say in this context that non-verbal communication seems to be more effective or is more effective, because human beings are lost in the use of words, whereas honeybees, unlike human beings, gain so much time and do not lose energy even when they travel a lot in terms of locating a particular spot. Obviously, we can say that the non-verbal communication is much more effective than the verbal, provided we need to ascertain the context. Now, remember the first lecture, communication is always happening within a context. So, do not jump into conclusions and say that, oh, non-verbal communication is more effective than verbal communication. You need to say, once you become a communication expert and a researcher in communication, you need to assert and say that, before I would say whether non-verbal is much more effective or verbal is effective, I need to ascertain the context and the situation and the commonality, the reference point that is used by the users. So, the answer is, if somebody is asking which aspect of communication, verbal or non-verbal, is more effective, you need to simply say depends on the context, the situation, the users, the channels, and the way communication takes place without any barriers in between. So, most of the times, although I say this, non-verbal will be much more effective, because in terms of impact, in terms of influence, it travels fast. It transmits the message faster than verbal communication, and the other person receives this faster than words. In fact, he does not pay attention to most of the words, but he or she pays more attention to the images. I am just going to prove these aspects in the coming slides. So, at this beginning point, understand that non-verbal communication is communication without words, using images, symbols, sign systems, pictures, gestures, postures, facial expressions, anything other than words. But at the same time, we need not belittle verbal communication. We have spent so many lectures on that. So, we need not belittle that, but we need to understand that non-verbal communication is a major aspect of communication, and if you can use verbal and non-verbal with skill and aplomb, if you can use it to integrate, complement, supplement one with the other, so then your communication skills are superior. So, to do this, just like the way you have understood about the basic communication aspects of verbal communication, you need to know more about non-verbal communication. So, let us try to understand more in terms of definition, more in terms of non-verbal communication. Simply put, we can say that non-verbal communication is a dynamic and continuous communication process where commonly understood codes are used by the senders and the receivers. Look at the definition carefully. It has certain important words aspects. A dynamic process, first of all. Now, verbal communication need not be dynamic. When you use words and when you stop using words, it is not dynamic. Now, when it is dynamic, it is always moving, always doing something, it is always active, it is online all the time. A dynamic and continuous, which means it is an ongoing process. That is why I put another question in the preview quiz, that I said, even if you stop communicating with somebody verbally, you start communicating with that person non-verbally. And it is true, because you think that I have stopped communicating with the person using words, but actually you start communicating with the person without using words, and you start communicating non-verbally. Now, if you have understood that, you understand that non-verbal communication is something that is dynamic, it is ongoing, and you cannot just stop, like the way you are able to stop verbal communication. Then you use commonly understood codes. You do not have to learn some words and then use the words, learn the meanings of those words, but you know some codes. So, even you can understand the codes by the cultural knowledge, not necessarily you need to learn through books. By your social behavior, your parents will teach you some codes. So, even you can use that, and as a sender and receiver, you will be either sending or receiving these codes. Some of the codes, for instance, can be expressed even in terms of using a flower. When you when it is friendship day, you want to give a yellow rose, and see the color of rose. Rose itself is indicating something that is friendly. As if you look at something like lotus, okay, which is more on the side of spiritual, whereas this is more on the side of human, where it is related to friendship, where it is, when it is going to be pink, it is going to indicate romance. When it is going to be a red rose, it is full of passion. So, same rose in terms of human relationships, in terms of colors, can indicate different meanings, messages can be conveyed. Now, flag again, each flag is representing a country on the one hand, and then the kind of flag that you use. Suppose it is white flag shown between two warring groups, you obviously understand that the one group is interested in making peace. Suppose the train is moving and then a red flag is shown. Now, the engine driver understands that there is a danger, I need to stop the train. He also waits for the green flag or green signal to be shown just when he wants to start the train from one station and to move on to the other one. Now, these are the codes. You can also use codes just by your fingers, by your hand movement. You can indicate so many things, sign language going by codes. So, it is a dynamic and continuous process which actually uses commonly understood codes between the sender and the receiver. Now, once you have understood, understand the basic nature of communication as such. There are some functional theorists of communication like Mehrabian, who has formulated this notion of communication, that he says, if you talk about communication, he says 93% of communication is just body language, and then he says it is only 7% that constitutes to the verbal aspect of communication, that is words. So, words versus body language, words will constitute only 7%, and then he says 93% is body language. Now, this seems to be an exaggeration. There are differing views, and then they even go up to, let us say, 65-35 kind of equation in terms of percentage of non-verbal and verbal respectively. But to start with, if you understand that this is what Mehrabian found, and it was something like a breaking news, and when he declared that most communication is non-verbal, he said this in his book Silent Messages, Implicit Communication and Emotions and Attitudes, published way back in 1971, and then later he communicated, continued with the same idea in nonverbal communication in 1972. He reasserted the point that if you analyze communication functionally, now what does it mean functionally? Taking the receiver side and then looking at from the perspective of the receiver and looking at from the function of a communication. You wanted to convey a message, how much message was communicated to the receiver. Now, that is the function. If the functions are carried out fully, you get 100%. And what do you use to convey the function? You are using words. Now, how much of the words are being used, and then how much of the non-verbal part of communication is affecting the receiver. Now, look at this. Mehrabian said that 7% is verbal, okay, 7% of the whole functional aspect of communication is verbal. Then 38% he says is vocal, that means they are not words, but it is the para-linguistic aspect such as tone, inflection and other sounds like even clearing the throat. So, making all sorts of noise, what I mean to say. So, using lot of sounds other than words, that constitutes 38%, and then the rest is 55%. Now, put together 55 plus 38, he makes it 93, where they are those aspects of communication where words are not at all used, and the non-verbal part exactly. Now, this 55% actually refers to actual non-verbal part, such as the facial expressions involved in communication, the pictures which are used, the images which are generated, the gestures, the body language, the overall presentation behavior and so on, that constitutes 55%. Now, once you understand and accept the fact that about 93% in terms of functionality of communication rests on nonverbal communication, don't you think that you should pay greater importance to this aspect of communication? Of course, yes. So, let us prove this point that 93% is nonverbal. Let us look at this email sent by a student way back, maybe 6 or 7 years before, when I was teaching a similar course on communication, a very basic course on communication, and I asked the students to interact with me on email and send the feedback on each of the lectures. Look at the email sent by this student. So, he has sent a feedback for lecture number 3, and in this feedback what he says, today we saw some barriers to communication which really was an eye opener to me. Now, what interests me in this email is something that I wonder as a Freudian slip, is that he says today we saw some barriers to communication which really was an eye opener to me. I was just delivering a lecture mostly in the chalk and talk method and using a PowerPoint, but since those were first year students, I was making my PowerPoint much more attractive and colorful to gain their attention. And since it was a huge number, it was about 600 students and a huge hall, in order to keep them spellbound, I was just making them look at certain colorful things on the PowerPoint. Apart from what I was trying to convey verbally, I was putting some good pictures, images, funny monkeys dancing here and there, but at the same time I was trying to prove my point. And then this was about barriers to communication, and I was just showing pictures to demonstrate that. Now, what he says that he saw some barriers. As I said, I was not showing a picture. You usually watch something on the TV, you go to see a movie, but you never go to see a lecture. You go to listen a lecture, sometimes hear a lecture, because sometimes you do not pay attention. So, it is mostly related to ears and of course eyes in terms of listening, not in terms of visually watching something. But the fact that Mehrabian's theory says 7% words, 93% verbal is not used, non-verbal is used, and it is a non-verbal that the receiver receives much more actively than the verbal. This email was just like a Freudian slip, something that was in his unconscious mind deep inside, and then he brought it out. He was not sure of what he was telling, but then to me it appeared that he is actually making a very valid point, that he was able to get more information through the pictures, images that I generated in the form of PowerPoint than through the words I was repeatedly using. So, instead of that being an eye opener to the student, it was an eye opener to the teacher as well. Even I realized at the end, if one has to make the class much more interesting, more of PowerPoints, more of images, just to correlate what we are going to tell, and then that makes the student get much more intensely than just mere use of words. Coming to the question now, why do we study nonverbal communication, or the importance of using nonverbal message, the importance of nonverbal messages as such. Now, basically nonverbal messages communicate emotions. Now, when verbal messages are something that are constructed using the cognitive function, brain particularly, intellectually we are involved in generating those words. Non-verbal communication is something that's sort of coming from the heart, from the emotional aspect of communication. So, most of the times when the mind tells something, emotion, the heart feels something else. and then whatever the heart feels is shown in the form of facial expressions, in the form of hand gestures, in the form of one's posture. So, what is inside is something that is expressed outside by the non-verbal communication, but what is intended verbally need not be the one that may be actually communicated. So, that is why you should understand that non-verbal messages are harder to hide and consciously control. So, they are more accurate indicators of how a person feels. So, it is harder to hide, it is not that easy to hide, and it is not that easily controllable also. Although I keep telling you that awareness about body language will help you control it, I cannot 100% guarantee that complete awareness of it will make you control negative body language, particularly in all communicative situations all the time. No, you will, even if you are an expert of non-verbal communication, you will commit some errors in terms of expressing yourself in communicative situations. Now, it is those errors in terms of non-verbal behavior will tell the audience what you are really trying to convey, and that is the message they will take first. So, understand the point that without non-verbal communication, you cannot not communicate. So, the double negative is just used to overemphasize the point that you cannot not communicate, meaning even if you wish to stop communication, you cannot do that. You can only stop verbal communication, but you will start non-verbal communication. Way back, Ralph Waldo Emerson, without thinking about body language, made a very wise statement. He said, "What you do speaks so loud that I cannot hear what you say. What you do speaks so loud that I cannot hear what you say." Meaning, you try to say something and try to convince me, but what you do, your actions, your behavior, your expressions, your postures, Emerson says that those things tell him so much than what the person really tries to convey using words. So, we can safely arrive at the decision that actions speak louder than words, of course, especially in non-verbal situation. To quote from a book on body language by Julius Fast, quote unquote, he says, "What often happens in any relationship is that language itself becomes a mask." This is another interesting aspect. So far, we have been talking about language in terms of communicating something very clearly, very vocally, very effectively. Now, in relationship situations where emotions are involved, this person says that language itself becomes a mask, language itself deceives, language itself is a camouflage, it is hiding something and a means of clouding and confusing the relationship. Most of the misunderstanding in human relationships are because of verbal use or abuse of words or misuse of words, overuse of words, overuse of channels. You try to say something, sending an SMS, the person has misunderstood, you send so many other SMS, then you try to send an email explaining that, you speak on phone, by the time the other person is in a kind of escalated, misunderstood mood. So, you ask for a personal interaction, the person is not giving time, by the time the person gives, you rush and then you explain more, again causing more miscommunication, it goes on. Now, what he says, it often confuses the relationship. If the spoken language is stripped away, if you can just remove words and the only communication left is body language, just like the honeybees where they used to use only body language, to communicate the place where honey is located. If you use this, the truth will find some way of pulling through. Spoken language itself is a great obscurer. So, this is a stance that generally non-verbalists take, saying that non-verbal is perhaps more significant, especially in those situations like human relationships, where actually words confuse and miscommunicate and actually harm the relationships. Having said this much about non-verbal communication, let us look at some basic forms of non-verbal communication. We can look at non-verbal communication in three forms, such as sign language, action language and object language. Sign language, action language, object language. There are other ways also, but let me explain this very quickly. First, sign language includes all those forms of codification in which words, numbers and punctuation signs are replaced by gestures. Look at this. Sign language includes all those forms of codification in which words, numbers and punctuation signs are replaced by gestures. So, if there is a comma while talking, I will make a small pause. If it is a full stop while talking, I may make a long pause. Okay. Now, to give a simpler example, if it is 2, I will use my hand to indicate that it is 2. If it is 3, I may say 3, use my fingers, 4, 5. Now, when I am using this, I am actually using gestures to replace numbers. So, same thing you can use again gestures. So, something to indicate home, people show that it is home and so on. So, you replace words with signs or gestures, then it becomes sign language. Most of the times people who are physically challenged, especially those who are not able to see clearly or those who are not able to speak clearly, what they do is they use sign language, one form or another. The other aspect of non-verbal communication expressed in a form is in terms of action language. Now, action language implies all movements that are not used exclusively as signals. Now, when I say, let us say 2, I am using this to indicate something, but then when I am just doing something on my hand, so I am actually trying to go with my thought flow, but if I remove that, and different people may use different kind of hand gestures. So, they do not have a specific meaning, but then they are like, if I do not use it and then just keep it straight, you will get a feeling that my ideas are not getting communicated effectively. So, action language implies all movements that are not used exclusively as signals. They are used to correlate thought patterns, ideas, but they do not signify something in a specific context universally. So, that when somebody does this, it may mean according to that context something, and somebody else does it, it can mean certain other things also. So, wide use of gestures, postures, especially not in a symbolic context. And then the third form is again an interesting form, is the object language. Now, this refers to meanings we attribute to objects around us. It comprises all intentional and non-intentional display of material things such as machines, architectural structure and also the human body and clothes. What is object language? It is referring to the objects or the meaning that we attribute to objects around us. It can be intentional or non-intentional display of things. It could be machines, architectural structure and also the human body and clothes. Architectural structure. Let us focus on the third form of non-verbal communication, that is object language. It refers to meanings we attribute to objects around us. That means, whatever objects are surrounding us, we try to attribute some meanings. Now, some meanings come because of some aspects of culture and sociological significance. Sometimes it just comes because of some brand value attached to some of the objects. It comprises all intentional and non-intentional display of material things such as machines. Now, machines also mean things like your car, your computer, your mobile, your personal accessories, all will come under machines. When you display, for instance, iPhone 4 and then you have a very simple mobile, you display so much that you are subscribing to a particular brand, you are showing that you can afford up to 30,000 to 40,000 for a mobile, or if you have iPad instead of laptop, again you are showing that you can afford more, you are more stylish, you want things which are compact, you want things which have some standard. So, machines includes all sorts of gadgets, electronic, electrical that we have. Architectural structure. So, the landmarks like Taj Mahal, immediately people think of India, immediately people associate that with something like a symbol of romance, something like a symbol of magnificence. So, architecture also connotes something. And also the human body, the body as such, the way you are decorating the body, the way you are performing using your body, and the way you are conducting yourself using clothes. I will just get into the details soon, but let us look at object language in terms of physical objects. When you look at physical objects, they can symbolize professional identity, such as stethoscope. Whenever you see a stethoscope, you immediately think that the person is a doctor. So, even small kids, when they want to play doctor and patient, so they will take this doctor's kit in plastic or some material. So, usually it will be a stethoscope and an injection or some first aid kit. So, the stethoscope particularly indicates that the person is professionally trained, qualified as a doctor. Similarly, if you see somebody with a briefcase, you understand that the person is an executive. If you see somebody with some books, some kind of notebooks, either you identify the person going to college, or if the person is elderly, you understand that the person is likely to be a teacher or a professor. So, you associate the person with education. So, looking at the physical objects, you understand the professional identity. Similarly, personal commitments can be seen in the form of wedding ring, engagement ring. You understand the person is committed. So, in an Indian context, when you see a woman wearing this in the Indian language, the Mangal Sutra, which indicates that the woman is married and she is wearing that special kind of chain that is worn by her by the hands literally of her husband and tied literally before so many people in public in a ceremonious holy gathering. So, that indicates that it is indicating the relationship that the woman is committed to lifetime. School t-shirt, college t-shirt and then house t-shirt will all indicate that they are belonging to a particular small community. And lifestyle as such, car as a status symbol. So, when you have a Nano and when you have an Audi, so you try to express so much in terms of size, in terms of the amount that you can afford to, in terms of the brand value that you are giving to some particular kind of car, in terms of the style status that you are trying to exude when you are driving that car. And then use of comfortable furniture. So, some people use crammed furniture, some people use comfortable furniture. To give a small example, the CEOs of companies will have the biggest table. There may be exceptions using smaller ones in terms of fashion and again in terms of modern thing. But generally when you go higher up and then go to the boss or the boss of bosses, so you find him having the biggest table there, maybe the biggest chair, the most coziest, the comfortable chair, the costliest sofa set with leather cover and all that, and the costliest decorated ones. I remember a novel written by Somerset Maugham in which he talks about a character, Elliot Templeton, where he says that he is so rich, okay, it's a millionaire, multimillionaire, and then he has decorated his home with lavish items, but then he has spent millions just to make it look so simple. So, it looks so simple that only a multimillionaire can afford to create that kind of simplicity. Again a fashion statement created using the objects. So, that is about object language. Now, what are the basic elements of nonverbal communication? We will look at all these elements in detail, but first what are the elements? Gestures, even above gestures we should keep facial expression, posture, body movement, eye contact. Some people would put eye contact on the top of all. Appearance, the overall appearance in terms of dressing, using accessories, silence, space. These days people even talk about interruptions as a powerful use of nonverbal communication. Although you use verbally to interrupt somebody, the very act of interrupting is also seen as a kind of aggressive, as a insecure kind of nonverbal communication to attack the speaker, for instance. So, these are basic elements. Now, soon we will look at the basic elements, and before we look at the basic elements, let us look at the functions of nonverbal communication. How are we going to use these elements functionally in a communicative situation? First, understand the concept that nonverbal communication is strongly related to verbal communication, especially in professional communicative situations. Nonverbal has strong correlation to verbal. Now, once you understand this, what are the functions as expressed by Ekman and Friesen long before, and the functions hold till true? Repeat what is said verbally, complement or clarify verbal meaning, contradict verbal meaning, regulate verbal interaction, substitute for verbal meaning. Now, first repeat what is said verbally. Now, there are teachers who will say 0 and then show 0. They will say 3 and then they will show 3. Whatever is said, that is repeated. So, repeat what is said verbally. Complement to clarify verbal meaning. Now, the cross section of heart, I am saying something, but then I also show a picture, or I draw the picture on the board and then show you. This is the cross section of heart. Now, instead of using words, here the picture will be equivalent literally to 1000 words. You understand what is this cross section, or when I talk about frontal view, aerial view of some machine. Now, instead of telling what it is, if I show that, I complement, I add to the verbal content there. Then contradict verbal meaning. I say something, but my non-verbal behavior is contradicting what I say. Remember the communicative situation between host and guest in an Indian context, which I mentioned in one of the previous lectures, where the host in an Indian context is supposed to read the non-verbal behavior of the guest and act accordingly. So, the guest wants to eat more, but the guest does not want to reveal that he or she wants to eat more. So, the guest will always pretend that he or she does not want to eat. The guest will say, rather I am on diet, I do not want to eat more today, but just because you are compelling, I want to eat. The host looks at the behavior of the person. It looks like the eyes are just wide open, looking at the delicious dishes kept on the table. The eyes are indicating that I am hungry, I am ravenous, I am craving for food. Okay. Now, mouth is saying that no, 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 I do not want food, I am dieting, I don't like to take oily stuff. Now, mouth is already started watering, salivating. Okay, almost water is coming out, is indicating that given a chance, if nobody is watching, he would eat the whole thing in a gulp. He is willing to swallow the whole thing, gobble up, eat greedily, but the host is there. So, verbally the person is trying to say that he is modest, he is not that uncultured to gobble up things, but then non-verbally he is trying to convey something else. Okay, continue with this situation. The host has already served something, let us say kept some rice, tasty biryani, and the person has eaten full very quickly, and then now he says, I think it is enough. Now, the host says, no, 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 have something more. No, 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 I do not want it, I do not want it. But actually the hands are saying keep more, keep more. The eyes are looking greedily, are you going to keep or not? But only words are saying no, 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 it is not required. But hands and eyes are indicating that no, I need more, much more. And they are even saying that do not listen to what my words are telling you. Take note of my body language and do that. And in an Indian context, hosts that way are experts of non-verbal analysis, and then they take cues from this, and good hosts are always known for taking this subtext clues from non-verbal form of communication. So, it contradicts verbal meaning. Then it regulates verbal interaction. How is it regulated? Look at a situation, the teacher says, now one by one you will introduce. When I say one, so the first fellow from this side will introduce. When I say two, the next fellow. When I say three, the next. Four, the next. Now, the teacher says one, the fellow says something. Two, three, four, and after four, the teacher does not say anything. She just shows hand to the guy who is sitting as fifth, and then sixth, and then seventh, and then eighth, 9, 10, 11. She is not saying that, but then she is just showing fingers, and instead of saying that, she is just regulating the sequence using hand, using gesture, using non-verbal communication. That is how you can regulate verbal interaction. Some commotion, teachers just does like this, regulating verbal interaction, or does like this and then says this. So, saying that you stop, I listen to this guy, regulating verbal interaction. It can also be used for substituting verbal meaning. Now, completely without using the verbal component, you can just use a substitute as a picture, as some kind of gesture. So, are you happy about this situation? Somebody asks somebody else in an interview. So, the person simply smiles, or a gleeful smile, so indicating I am very happy. So, you do not do anything, but then you substitute that verbal meaning. So, that is how you are able to understand the functions of non-verbal communication. Now, once you have understood this, try to use them. Why I am saying this? Most of the times when you say something verbally, use non-verbal to repeat, especially if you are in a professional context, use it. Use non-verbal to clarify certain verbal meaning, complement them. Use non-verbal as an extended form of communication. Use verbal carefully so that the verbal meaning will never contradict your non-verbal meaning. So, this again makes you a very straightforward person of communication, that you are very direct. So, when you are hungry, just be quite honest about it, especially in this host guest situation that I talked about. So, if you are the guest, just say that I am little bit hungry, I will appreciate if you could give me this much of food, thank you. Now, the verbal and the non-verbal are not contradicting, and the host is not getting an impression that you are rather pretentious, you are not that honest with yourself. Forget you being honest with others. So, understand this aspect. Understand also the fact that you can regulate verbal interaction by using non-verbal communication. Then you can also use this as a substitute for verbal meaning. So, very often when you try to use 1000 words to describe something, you can just use a simple picture, a simple model, or in a communicative situation, a nod, effective nod, frown or smile will all indicate that you are substituting the verbal, but much more effectively and trying to convey the meaning. Now, keep thinking about this part of non-verbal communication in relation to whatever I have said from the beginning. I said at the beginning that non-verbal is a very significant aspect of communication, but I also try to assert by giving the example between address being communicated by human beings and a location being communicated by honeybees, in which I try to show that honeybees act in a much more superior way than human beings, but nevertheless I also try to tell you that do not immediately jump into the conclusion that non-verbal is much more superior than verbal. I also try to tell you that it depends on the situation, context and the uses and the quotes and the words that you are trying to use in that context. Okay. Then I also try to show the function, the types, and also I talked about the significance of non-verbal communication. Now, reflect on these ones and then get ready for the next lecture. And in the next lecture, actually I will take you to the various forms, aspects, and I will try to tell you in detail and try to continue with certain do's and don'ts, eye contact, voluntary, involuntary dimensions, and so on. Till we go to that lecture, I say bye and thank you for giving enough attention to this lecture. And in the next lecture, I will slightly move ahead, go bit faster, because now in this I have given you enough grounding on non-verbal communication. So, we will meet again in the next lecture. Till then, thank you, bye.